Welcome back to our channel. Today I want to take you back in time, not to hear another retelling of the famous Kennedy legacy as we've all heard it countless times, but to immerse ourselves in the life of someone who often feels more like a silent prelude to his renowned siblings. We're talking about Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., the bright and charismatic firstborn son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, brother to John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy, and a figure who was expected by friends, family, and probably by history itself to carry the torch that later ended up in his younger brother's hands. When people talk about the Kennedy curse, it's often John and Robert, or John Jr. and the plane crash, or the more recent tragedies that come to mind. Joseph Jr.'s story is sometimes overshadowed, perhaps because of his older place in the timeline, and the overshadowing achievements of the siblings who survived into adulthood. But if we rewind to the early 1940s, he was without a doubt the golden boy of the family. He was the one everyone thought might become president someday, long before anyone suspected John, the second son, would eventually take the oath of office. From an early age, Joe Jr. wore this mantle of responsibility like a badge of honor. Friends recall that, even in childhood, he was the big brother who could calm a crying toddler or rouse a group of siblings for a baseball game in the yard. He had that natural ability to take charge, not in an overbearing way, but in a manner that invited people in, like he was always setting the tone. His father, Joseph Sr., doted on him. He saw in his firstborn a reflection of his own ambition, a boy who could become anything. It's said that when Joe Jr. was around 10, his father told him, "Someday, my boy, you might be president of the United States." A statement that for many kids would be a dream, but for Joe Jr., it felt more like destiny. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the world was steeped in economic turmoil. The Great Depression hammered the global economy, but the Kennedy family, thanks to Joseph Sr.'s business acumen, managed not only to stay afloat, but to increase their wealth in certain ventures. Still, Joe Jr. would have been fully aware of the plight affecting millions. The culture of service in the Kennedy household, blended with Catholic teachings about caring for the less fortunate, shaped his worldview. Even as a teenager, Joseph Jr. was known to volunteer his time with charity events, sometimes helping out with philanthropic efforts that his mother Rose organized through the church. This sense of giving back, combined with a certain swagger he developed at Choate, made for a remarkable young man, simultaneously privileged and aware of the demands of leadership, with a healthy dose of that signature Kennedy confidence. Of course, in the 1930s, the quiet but growing tide of conflict in Europe was hard to ignore. Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany in 1933, the same year Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in the United States. As Joe Jr. went through his teens, finishing at Choate and moving on to Harvard, the worldwide political climate was growing increasingly tense. Fascism had taken root in several countries. The Spanish Civil War served as an ominous prelude to something bigger and darker. By 1939, World War II would officially break out in Europe, though the United States initially held back from direct involvement until the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. This was the backdrop against which Joseph Jr. came of age. At Harvard, he was a bright star, studying government and showing a keen interest in diplomacy and politics. It's said that he loved a good debate and wasn't afraid to speak his mind. During his time at Harvard, he also maintained an extensive social circle. Whether sailing on Cape Cod or playing touch football with his siblings at the family compound in Hyannisport, he had an ease about him that invited people in. It didn't hurt that he was tall, handsome, and projected that grin that would become a family trademark. Yet behind that charm was a young man with big convictions, strong convictions sometimes, that would put him at odds with even his father. One lesser-known fact is that Joseph Jr. harbored a skepticism about Britain's role in the war, and even some aspects of American involvement overseas. His father, Joseph Sr., had been the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, posted there starting in 1938. During that time, Ambassador Kennedy gained a reputation for appeasement-minded views, expressing doubts about Britain's ability to withstand the Nazi onslaught and advocating for caution in America's approach to the conflict. In an odd twist, Joseph Jr. seemed early on to echo some of his father's sentiments and was wary of the growing impetus for the U.S. to intervene. But that wariness would undergo a transformation once he wore the uniform himself. Joseph Jr. graduated from Harvard in 1938 and didn't waste time in plotting out the next chapter of his life. A short stint in law school was overshadowed by the fact that Europe was now ablaze with war. The question wasn't if America would get involved, but when. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Joseph Jr. enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve. Some accounts indicate that he considered joining sooner, but waited to see how events would unfold. Regardless, once he joined, he was determined to serve with distinction. This was, after all, the war that would define his generation's legacy, and he wanted to be right in the thick of it. He trained to be a naval aviator, eventually getting assigned to pilot bombers. This is a crucial point in his story. Joe Jr. was not content to have a safe, desk-bound post. He actively sought out combat missions. He wanted to do his part, to prove himself perhaps, or to stand for something bigger than his own political ambitions. Family members later recounted how proud he was to earn his wings of gold. He was fiercely patriotic and determined, sometimes to a fault. As the war raged, Joseph Jr. completed nearly 25 combat missions. Stationed mainly in England, he flew with the British Naval Command in anti-submarine warfare. The North Atlantic was a treacherous arena. German U-boats lurked beneath the waves, threatening Allied shipping lanes. Joe Jr. was credited with sinking one submarine in a daring run that gave him a certain amount of local fame among the Allied forces stationed in the UK. Such feats confirmed everything people believed about him, that he was courageous, quick under pressure, and a natural leader in the air. But behind these heroic missions, there was a family living day to day with the anxiety of a son, a brother in the line of fire. Rose Kennedy, devout and constantly worried, would pray for her sons fervently. By this time, John F. Kennedy was also serving in the Navy, commanding a PT boat in the Pacific, so Rose had more than one child in combat. In letters back home, Joe Jr. was affectionate and confident. He would reassure his mother and father that he was fine, that he believed in the cause. That might be one of the greatest tragedies of Joseph Jr.'s story. By the summer of 1944, he had already completed enough missions to go home. He'd served with honor and could have received a desk job or an instructor role. But there was a new top-secret mission known as Operation Aphrodite, an experimental plan to use B-24 and B-17 bombers loaded with explosives as remote-controlled flying bombs to target heavily fortified Nazi positions, particularly the V-1 rocket sites in France. These pilotless planes would theoretically be guided via radio from a mother plane once the crew parachuted out, but it was incredibly dangerous and untested. Joseph Jr. volunteered for this mission. He saw it as his duty, as a chance to do something that could shorten the war, save Allied lives, and prove once and for all his dedication to his country. Here's a rarely mentioned detail. Some within his squadron reported that Joe Jr. had an unusual sense of determination about this mission, as if he knew it might be his last time to serve meaningfully before the conflict's end. With D-Day having taken place in June 1944, Allied forces were pushing into France. The war was turning in the Allies' favor, but the Nazi Phi-1 rockets were terrorizing England, causing civilian casualties and widespread fear. Stopping them would be a huge psychological and tactical victory. On August 12, 1944, Joseph Jr. climbed into a converted B-24 loaded with explosives. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Wilford John Willey, was there alongside him to help get the plane airborne and guide it toward the target. The plan was for them to bail out once the course was locked in, leaving the plane to be remotely piloted into the target. Sadly, they never got that chance. Soon after takeoff, while the aircraft was still loaded with 21,170 pounds of Torpex, an extremely potent explosive, something went disastrously wrong. A malfunction triggered a premature detonation. The plane exploded in midair, killing both men instantly. The official explanation was an electrical fault or a stray signal. Some have speculated there could have been sabotage, though that's never been substantiated. Regardless, the result was a devastating loss. Back at home, the Kennedys were plunged into mourning. The father, Joseph Sr., was in shock. His golden boy, the son who was supposed to carry the family's political ambitions forward, was gone. Rose was inconsolable, losing the first of what would become a long string of tragedies. John F. Kennedy, still in recovery from his own war wounds, was dealt a crushing emotional blow, as were all the siblings who so deeply admired their older brother. This is where the story of Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. tends to fade from mainstream memory, overshadowed by the subsequent achievements of his brothers, John's presidency, Robert's political rise, Ted's Senate career. But let's not let that overshadow the personal dimension of this loss. One rarely heard anecdote comes from a friend who served with Joe Jr. in the Navy. This friend said that Joe confided in him just weeks before his death, expressing a desire to one day take up the cause of rebuilding Europe after the war. He said, "We can't turn our backs on a ruined continent. We'll have to help them build a new democracy, or else we'll pay for it later." That was the mindset of someone who was already looking beyond the battlefield. The seeds of the Marshall Plan and other post-war efforts might have found an articulate champion in Joseph Jr. had he survived. It's important to realize that Joseph Jr.'s death didn't just rob the Kennedy family of a beloved son. It altered the entire course of that family's history. Before his passing, Joe Jr. had been widely expected to pursue a political career. He was, by many accounts, the one his father had painstakingly groomed. He had a commanding presence, was well-liked, and was already starting to form connections that would have propelled him into Congress, or maybe even the Senate, and perhaps onward to the White House. Without him, that pressure fell, sometimes uncomfortably, onto John. JFK had always been described as a bit more studious, more introspective, a bit overshadowed in terms of raw presence by his older brother. But with Joe Jr. gone, John was essentially next in line, and the rest, as we know, is history. Some controversies have emerged over the decades regarding Joseph Jr. and his father's relationship to the war. There are historians who point out that Ambassador Kennedy's defeatist attitude toward Britain, particularly in the early days of World War II, may have influenced Joe Jr. to volunteer for especially risky missions, to prove something, perhaps to the family or to the broader public, that the Kennedys were willing to sacrifice. Others have tried to spin a narrative that Joe Jr. was at times overly sympathetic to certain isolationist sentiments before the U.S. officially entered the war. But the complexity is that many Americans held isolationist views in the late 1930s and early 1940s, fearing another devastating conflict like World War I. Joe Jr. was not unique in that respect. By the time he enlisted, he seemed wholeheartedly committed to the Allies' cause. The historical debate continues. If Joe Jr. had survived, would he have carried on or even magnified his father's controversial positions regarding foreign policy? Or would he have developed his own distinct approach informed by the realities he witnessed in combat? There's also a lingering question about his father's intense ambition. Joseph Sr. was known to be domineering and had high expectations for all his children. Some critics argue that the environment in which Joe Jr. was raised propelled him toward taking more risks than he otherwise might have, to embody the ideal of a valiant hero. Others argue that Joe Jr. was a grown man, fully capable of making his own decisions, and that the sense of duty that drove him was quite genuine and personal. In the end, it's probably some combination of the two. The Kennedys' environment was undeniably competitive and high pressure, but Joe Jr. also had a personal sense of patriotism and moral conviction. What's beyond debate is the heartbreak left in his wake. Newspaper reports of the time painted him as a fallen hero, cut down just when his future was about to begin. The family set up the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation to honor his memory, focusing on disability rights and research, largely inspired by the experiences of his sister Rosemary, who had her own struggles. In a poignant twist, the philanthropic and service-oriented path the Kennedys would take in the decades to come owed something in part to Joe Jr.'s sacrifice. Without the deep tragedy of losing him, the push to memorialize him through charitable endeavors might have been less urgent. If we look at the historical significance, Joseph Jr.'s story reminds us of how entire legacies can pivot on a single moment. The Kennedys' place in American politics might be unrecognizable if that plane hadn't exploded in August 1944. Maybe Joe Jr. would have become the congressman, senator, or even the president. Maybe John would have pursued academia or journalism, only stepping into a supportive role. The lineage of the Kennedy curse, if one believes in that idea, might not have developed in the same pattern. The heartbreak that overshadowed the family for decades, Rosemary's struggles, Kathleen's accidental death in 1948, John's assassination in 1963, Robert's assassination in 1968, and more. Those tragedies might still have happened, but their context would undoubtedly have been different with Joe Jr. at the helm. History is a tapestry woven from 1,000 threads of chance and choice, and Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. is the prime example of a single thread that could have unraveled a very different pattern had he not been lost. In diaries left by some of his friends, you find references to Joe Jr. cracking jokes at the local pub in England, sharing cigarettes with the ground crew, giving pep talks to new arrivals who were trembling at the thought of combat. He was human. He had fears, but he also had that push, that drive that so many in his family possessed, to stand out, to lead, to excel. And that's the contradiction of the Kennedys. Behind the grand photos and shining smiles, there was often heartbreak and fragility, a willingness to step into risk, sometimes heedlessly. Looking back at his life, we are reminded that behind the big events of history, behind the headlines and the genealogies and the conspiracies, there are individuals who for a time believe they'll live long enough to see the promises they make to themselves come true. Joseph Jr. believed he would see the war end, return home, start a political career, maybe one day run for president. He believed in that future wholeheartedly, which made his final mission all the more courageous or tragic, depending on how you view it. So that's Joseph P. Kennedy Jr.'s story, a man with fierce determination, unwavering confidence, a radiant sense of duty, and a tragic ending that still resonates whenever we speak of the Kennedys. Perhaps now, The next time someone mentions the Kennedy family in passing, you'll think of the brother who never got to fulfill the destiny that many believed was his. And maybe you'll feel, as I do, both admiration for his bravery and a lingering sorrow for the promise that ended in the skies over England in a war that demanded so much of a generation. Thank you so much for joining me on this extended look into his life. It's stories like these, full of hope, ambition, and heartbreak, that remind us how delicate our paths can be, how a single moment can shape decades to come. I hope this exploration has not only given you new insights into Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., but also sparked some reflection on the countless stories of people, both famous and unknown, whose dreams were interrupted by forces beyond their control. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.